I would like to come back after this break and let you stare at the main takeaways. What I would like you to do is just look at them, try to internalize them. I would, as I was talking about, as I've encouraged throughout this class, make your own notes. I promise one thing though, the main takeaways and things like that I will put up on the web for you, because these are issues that I think you need to think every time you do some analysis or you think about life. So let's talk about what's this rest of the week look like. Final. We haven't talked too much about testing, and let me just first tell you my philosophy of testing. I think exams and tests are largely useless. And I'm sorry I'm saying this, I'm an educator, I've been in this business for many years, I have studied for about, more than a decade after my high school. But I believe testing is largely useless if you have been focused. So give you an example. At the business school here, we teach classes and we have exams and everything periodically. We also teach executives, people working in firms. Very rarely, if at all, we have tests for executives. But because the goals of the program and the pedagogy and the teaching is all intertwined and makes sense and is value creating, testing takes secondary, tertiary, almost no role. We don't test. People work very hard. I recognize that in large groups of people, testing is important, just to see whether you know enough. So I would like you to take that attitude towards the final. The attitude being, I'm not being tested, I'm not a good guy or a bad guy, I'm just trying to figure out how much I know. Take that attitude and a test will become easy. So here's a few tips I'll give you. Now this may be too late. All my tips may come a bit late in the day, but well, that's the way life is. If you have stayed up to date, there's no need to study for the final. By that I mean, what do I mean by up to date? You understand what we've been talking about. The only thing missing is my discussions with you. The class is, that's the one downside of online, is that the classes are huge. But hopefully the forums have helped you, your own thinking, the textbooks, and you kept up to date. The one thing I promise you is if you have been doing all the video examples and everything, and you have been doing the assignments, I guarantee you, you're naturally up to date. I don't believe in testing people on things that I never spoke about, because that's easily done and it's really silly. If you have done all assignments, figure out what mistakes you tend to make. Now this will be a tough one, because again, online, I think you know already, but I want to emphasize, all grading is done by the computer. So you have to take on the pressure of figuring out what mistakes you've tended to make. And I think if you read enough, if you've been following things enough, you should have sorted that out. But I would go back and look at all the assignments and see how you've been doing and what are, people make typical mistakes, and if you're making those mistakes and you're on top of them, no need to study. No need to study. Just relax. The key to finance is it's like swimming. It's not memorizing. And if you remember that, the force will be with you. So for example, what I mean by the force, let's take a very practical example, okay, of course. And that is, if you know how to swim, I can pick you up in a sleep and throw you in the deep end. I guarantee you, you won't drown. But if I have not taught you how to swim, if the subject matter is all about rules and regulations and tax codes, what will you do? You'll drown, because you couldn't feasibly remember all that boring stuff. And unfortunately, life is full of boring stuff. And finance is so awesome because nothing boring, right? You have to remember some little rules here and there, right? Otherwise, it's so cool. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on the final. All I would recommend to you is just remain focused on what you've done in the past, with one caveat. I do recognize that the last week, by definition, involved a lot of thinking. Very little Excel, lot of thinking. And that thinking may take time to sink in. That's why I have no work for you to do this week in terms of assessments, in-class exercises, video exercises, because I want you to just go back and think through the past, but with more emphasis on the last week, because the last week put things together to some extent. Okay? So that's the final. Some further learning that I think you should look for. And this depends very clearly on your background. So the way I have taught this class is it's very challenging. I recognize that. I refuse to teach a class which you could easily learn elsewhere. I mean, because that's not the point of this course. The point of this course is to use principles that are just written in terms of formulas and so on, and taught that way. This class, the main objective of mine was not to repeat all that stuff, but to empower you to learn. However, 10 weeks are not enough to learn everything. So I want to emphasize some important issues again. And this is from the context of finance and of course life, because everything else doesn't matter. Okay, so do a class on accounting. This I have said before. There are two things in this class that I didn't do fully because we didn't have time. One of them was accounting. And I admit, even though my colleagues would hate me to say this, that accounting belongs more in the memory domain. So the good news is, if you're interested in accounting rules, you don't need to do much. The bad news is, accounting rules are not the way we teach accounting at a good school. We teach accounting from a conceptual, practical purpose. And what I want to say there is, it's not so much you memorize what's in a balance sheet or income statement, but you know how to evaluate the meaning behind the balance sheet and income statement, with one major caveat: they are largely not real numbers. Not because somebody is trying to cheat, but the accounting system is not geared to provide real cash flows. That's the main challenge, right? So discount rates is not that important because we'll go to market data and we go to equity traded and return on debt and so on. But for doing cash flows, I would recommend very strongly to understand balance sheet and income statement. And if you do that, what it helps you do is create cash flows. So with that emphasis in mind, do a class on financial statement analysis. Cost accounting is a very important area in business too, but I'm emphasizing what's relevant to further learning vis-a-vis this class, understanding finance. Second, statistics. I can't emphasize it enough. So much so that I actually taught you some statistics because I felt compelled to do so. But remember, I taught you only to the extent you needed to know for an introductory class. I would encourage you to do statistics somehow. Take an online class. I know Coursera is offering a statistics class. I would do this because it's maybe more useful than finance. I can't believe I just said it, but it could be. I have doubts about it, but it's a pretty close third. Love, finance, and statistics. Accounting is needed because it's a language, right? However, I want to spend a little bit of time on what more finance is key to moving forward. And I know I'm going to push finance very strongly here, not because I'm in finance, it's because I think it's a very natural and important way to look at the world. So the things that you want to do when you have the time is revisit valuation with a lot of case-based exposure. This was what we do. Now, this makes it a little bit challenging for an online context, but if you can find a way of looking up cases, Harvard produces very good cases, we produce good cases, but look at cases, because cases kind of make you think about issues that are closer to the real world. You can also start just building your own case. You can start valuing stuff on your own. But I think what that will do will give you more exposure rather than necessarily more concepts. So we teach a class on valuation that follows the core class. And this happens both at the undergrad and the MBA level. And what that class does is, its main purpose is to solidify your learning of the core concepts, not to take off completely. So for example, taxes feature heavily in the applied case context because they matter. However, they are an added layer, not substituting the fundamentals. I would encourage you to try to read a book, take a class on something called real options. Real options is also called, broadly speaking, falls under the category of decision making under uncertainty. Now, those are not identical things. So the typical decision tree analysis is only part of real options analysis, and I don't have the time to emphasize that, but it's a very important difference. And it has to do with time value of money, right, and risk. Whereas decision tree analysis could be done in a very mechanical way, mechanistic way, and that's not what real options is. So why am I emphasizing real options? Because though we did NPV, NPV is not the best in a changing environment, and our environment is changing rapidly these days. Real options takes NPV and turns it up a notch, big notch, and what it does is it makes a static analysis dynamic. NPV at the end of the day is a static view. So you make a decision today, you're very active, dynamic today, but your predictions of the future are pretty much static in the sense that the manager ability to make good or bad decisions are taken out of the NPV calculation. So to understand what I just said, you need to kind of expose yourself to real options. I'll encourage you to kind of read a few articles here and there. What the trouble with online is I could put up a lot of articles out there, but copyright issues and the fees that go to it will just add up so much money to your pocket that it won't be worthwhile. The good news is you can Google articles and start reading on your own. Do this. It's important. The first two kind of further thinking or doing classes or reading up had to do with valuation. So valuation NPV way, valuation real options way, which is NPV on steroids, if you may. But do also try to figure out what financing is all about. Remember, we spent some time on stocks and bonds and how to put them together to get the cost of capital, but that's what's not the main focus of the class. I think it's venture capital firms, banking firms, all kinds of interesting financing things are happening in the real world which could be very appealing to you. So a lot of what you do depends on what you want to do, right? So it may be a good idea to get to know more about financing. And finally, for my purposes, for the next level, some of you may want to do portfolio management, asset management. You may want to do what, say, for example, Fidelity does or Vanguard does, or in your own country, the company in which you have invested or likely to hopefully invest in the future. How do they manage portfolios and so on? I gave you some sense of diversification, but portfolio management, asset management, hedge fund management, these are all kind of issues that if you're interested in, you need to take a deeper dive. So I'm just laying out paths here. So there are three paths here. If you want to continue on valuation, do more valuation and real options. If you want to think about financing, there's a separate track. And finally, you could just think about portfolio management, which is a whole field of its own. And by the way, just as an aside, most of my research has been in the equity markets and so on. I find it just fascinating. Okay. Let's take a break here. I'll come back and wrap up, believe it or not, the class with some good thoughts about the future and some pieces of advice, if you may. Of course, you don't have to listen to me, but just some thoughts. And I have some people to thank and have some fun with you, and we'll come back and let's do that. Take a break.